Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Ironis Insights. I have a great guest here today, Sidney Nakahodo. He's the founder of Seldor Capital. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Alex. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're enjoying the weather here. So why don't you tell us where you're calling from?
Yeah, I'm based in New York City.
Yeah, that's right. Best city in the world.
It is.
Glad to have someone in New York on the show. Always good to have someone local. And we're enjoying beautiful weather today. I'd like to get into your background before we dive into everything. So, tell me a little bit about how you got to where you are today and what got you interested in finance.
Absolutely. Right. So a lot of people who get involved in the space sector, which is my area of focus, they, they tend to come from a technical background or there's rocket scientists. In many ways, my background is a little bit different because I didn't work for NASA or I didn't work for a space agency, but I was motivated by science fiction. And that's how I initially started thinking about humanity going to space and the next frontier. So I studied engineering as a consequence. But what led me to work with the space sector is a different angle. It is an angle that comes from international development. I used to work at the World Bank, and at the World Bank, I saw how technologies can impact societies, and particularly in places where they have much less resources available. Right. So, what I imagine is that a space could play that transformative role for everyone. We were lucky to live in a time where we are starting to see the emergence of these space technologies impacting all areas of life, particularly through a commercial standpoint. Right? So you start seeing, you see entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, uh, and others that are taking advantage of the evolution of technology, but also how the ecosystem has evolved over time that has allowed commercial companies to play a very important role in the space sector.
So interesting, right? And I feel like it's a big unknown for a lot of people. So I mean, like for someone outside the industry, what's the biggest misconception about the commercial space economy today? Like what do you think?
That's a great question, right? Because I think still a lot of people still think that space is only rockets and satellites.
Yeah.
And people still think about space in terms of exploration. Hopefully, things are changing right now when we see companies sending satellites to space that are impacting lives in terms of facilitating communications.
Mhm.
When you think about weather forecasts, that depends on space assets. When we think about climate change, right, that depends on monitors that we use also in space. We cannot use our cell phones without things that happen in space. We cannot even think about traveling without space activities. So having this bigger dimension of what space represents to our economy, to our society, is very important because it broadens the spectrum of activities related to space and that depend on space. Very important to think about space more like infrastructure than in terms of exploration, I would say.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I think there is that. I mean, you brought up a really good point, which is, a lot of folks think rockets, think, everything that jumps on the news, here's a new rocket launch, astronauts stuck in space, whatever it is. And you don't realize how much we actually need everything that's out there. And when you look at your phone, when I look at my phone when I'm, in the subway and I have no service, and it says point it to the sky to see if you can, to see if you can find a satellite to get a signal now. This is relatively new, and it's only evolving. I'm curious, what are you seeing? What else are you seeing that's maybe progressing to be using space for? Anything top of mind?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Right now, most people understand that space makes an impact on our lives, right? As you mentioned, Alex, like GPS, right? It's something that is so important for us that we don't even think about. This is part of what we call space for Earth technologies. So technologies in space that have an immediate impact in what we do. The next frontier of space technologies are going to be the space technologies that enable other space technologies that will impact life on Earth. Right? Just to give a few examples, uh, in a in a lot long distance future, we're going to be able to produce drugs in space. Right? And in space, we're going to be able to do things differently because of low gravity. And that will enable us to achieve solutions that complement developments that we carry out here on Earth. Right? So create an infrastructure for these labs for manufacturing in space is what we're going to start seeing in the next decade. Companies that are developing, for example, space stations, commercial space stations, is something that is going to enable the next frontier of those technologies, particularly because we are starting creating this critical mass of commercial activities. Right? So we have investors, we have customers, we have service providers that are part of the ecosystem. As the ecosystem develops, we'll start to see more applications that we cannot even imagine right now.
It's incredible. I mean, talking about manufacturing pharmaceuticals in space, I mean, that's insane. That's really literally insane. I mean, and there's a lot of talk as well, and a lot of the reports that I've read involving data centers in space all kind of revolve around it being way too expensive right now. But maybe that's just right now, right? Maybe there will be a point in time where it can be more cost effective and obviously a little bit cheaper to cool in space. So I don't know. Have you looked into anything involving the data centers recently?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing up this topic. 2 years ago, talking about data centers in space sounded like science fiction, right?
Uh-huh.
And over the past 12 months, it's become this buzzword.
Yeah.
And Seldor Capital, the firm that I run, we have invested in space data centers.
Mm.
And the main thesis was exactly what you pointed out, right? There's some physical advantages in space. The cooling is one aspect. Of course, we still need to develop technology to take advantage of those physical factors. But there's also the economic factor, right? So here on Earth, it's getting more expensive to grow a data center farm or to expand your data center capabilities, right? Because of energy constraints, because of environmental constraints, right? Land is a constraint depending on where you go. In space, once the technology has been addressed, right, it's in the initial stage that's probably harder to execute, becomes much more feasible. It's going to be easier to scale. So that's how we think about space data centers, right? In terms of scaling capabilities, taking advantage of the resources that are abundant in space, right? The cooling aspect is one, solar energy is another one, the increasing demand for data capabilities, right? And there's another dimension that people don't talk too much about it, but there's resilience. You add another layer of resilience in space when you're able to store data in a physical place that's harder to access, right? We know that a lot of hacking of data centers not only happens virtually, but also physically, right? You break into a data center or you have capabilities to access information, or even like we saw in the Middle East recently, war can destroy access to data, and that has a significant impact for those who depend on those resources, right? In space, that can happen, but right now it's much harder, and that's where we're starting to see sovereign more interested in also that security layer, in addition to all the economic factors that we discussed.
Yeah, I guess you'll have a couple less break-ins when you have the location in space, right?
Exactly. Eventually, we're gonna face the same problems in space, the same as we see here on Earth. But right now, it creates another layer of security.
Makes sense. So, when you're talking to, let's say, early stage companies in the space, right? What separates the founders who get your attention? Maybe get you. Is it the founders that get your attention? Is it what they're working on? What separates them?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? Because the way that we see entrepreneurs has evolved over time. Right? In the past, probably we used to think about the traditional factors. Was the founder's background is always important, but you used to think about what's the market opportunity and if the technology is compelling. Right? Space is a sector that is evolving so fast that we need to rethink our mental models when we assess an opportunity. Right? Just to give a couple of examples, sometimes the best space entrepreneurs, they don't have a space background. They saw a problem in a different sector that space can address. So some of the best founders that I know, they are not space engineers or rocket scientists. They come from marketing. They come from different areas of business. Sometimes they know a particular business pretty well. Quite often, they are very open-minded and they can spot opportunity, and the business savviness, I would say, is sometimes even more important than the technology background. The second thing is that you really have to understand which market you're addressing, because in markets that are more mature, then you can use more tangible metrics, right? So what's your recurring revenue? Then you can come up with projections, like who are your customers, who are your competitors. In space, a lot of markets, they are not formed yet. Right? And if the founder understands that dynamic, then it's much easier for you to evaluate the risks that you are taking, right? In some markets, the founder has to work directly with their customers in order to develop those capabilities, right? This is a second aspect. The third one, it is not necessarily to think about where we are right now, but where we're going to be next 5 to 10 years, right? And you asked me about, well, what are the latest trends. I mentioned Space for Space, but I'm also increasingly excited, for instance, in what the lunar economy is going to, the opportunity that the lunar economy is going to create for us. So we have a couple of companies that are targeting on moon activities, because I believe that that's the next frontier for companies that are going to be developing the lunar economy, and they're going to be the first movers. So there's an important factor on being a first mover too, depending on the market segment that you are addressing.
Dive into that. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen on the moon? What do you think's first? What do you think's most important?
Do we have another hour or two to talk about this?
I mean, I'm fascinated.
Absolutely, right. It's important to think about drivers of the lunar economy, right? Because otherwise, like you think, okay, we're going to go to the moon like we did 50 years ago during the Apollo era, and we plant a flag and we move on. This time is different. And the main drivers are, first, there's a space race, but not in the typical sense or traditional sense, right? There's a commercial component, and the idea is to establish a permanent presence on the moon that will generate economic activity. Initially, we're going to start seeing mostly investments driven by government expenses, right? And we're talking, of course, about the U.S. government, but other countries are also betting heavily on the moon. Right? But what happens is that once government points out and defines a permanent presence on the moon as a priority, that triggers a value chain. So like you need companies that will provide a service for the government. You need companies that will be providing service for the companies that will be providing service for the government, so on and so forth. And that's how you create a market. That's exactly the model that happened with the International Space Station. Why we created the International Space Station? I would say that the main benefit of it is that it created a reason for us to develop SpaceX, because then you could start ferrying cargo, you could start ferrying astronauts, and you could create competition so that who would provide cheaper services, better services. So it's the same dynamic that we're starting to see on the moon. Mm-hmm. So what kind of activities are we going to see on the moon? There's raw material for sure. There's this discussion about critical minerals on Earth, and going to the moon is a stepping stone. Maybe we're going to be able to extract resources on the moon. I see that also as a stepping stone in terms of learning, because eventually you're going to be able to extract resources from other parts of the solar system. But this is in the long run. In the short run, governments will be putting money into developing those capabilities. The second thing is that there's the geopolitical aspect. Right? Whoever gets there right now occupies that piece of land, because the moon doesn't belong to anyone. But there's some areas on the moon that are very valuable, just like real estate. If you're close to water and there's some water deposits on the moon, that gives you a very important competitive advantage in the long run, because you need water to be able to not only survive, but also eventually going to be using water as a source of fuel for your space missions. And maybe the third one is that some countries, they see the moon as a way to project supremacy, or to project vision. Mm-hmm. Right? And this is very important. Those symbolic aspects, they tend to be underlooked, but we forget that the Apollo era inspired so many generations to become the scientists, engineers that created the microcomputers, that led the revolution, that for all the things that we see on the eye today. Right? So, in a nutshell, the lunar economy is a natural sequel to what we're seeing today. And just like space data centers sounded like science fiction a couple of years ago, the lunar economy still sounds like science fiction, but it's going to be something very, very common in just a few years.
It's going to be very real very soon, it sounds like. It's really interesting to hear, and I can't wait to see it. So, I mean, as the space economy continues to grow, right? What do you see being the biggest bottlenecks right now?
That's a very important question, right? We tend to think about technology as the biggest bottleneck. And in many ways, it still is. In order for you to get that stage of a functional lunar economy, you need rockets to get there. Last week, we saw Blue Origin's rocket exploding. It's very easy to think that, okay, that's so hard, and then we're not there yet. But technology is evolving so fast that that issue is going to be addressed. The second thing that people tend to think about is, okay, maybe it's capital. Right? Like, who's going to invest in a company that's going to be doing lunar activities? Well, I can tell you that right now, there's some lunar companies that are unicorns, whose valuation is more than $1 billion. And why is that? Because they have access to contracts, multi-million-dollar contracts from the government. And that creates a stable revenue, a source of revenue. Right? And for investors like ourselves, it doesn't matter if money is coming from the government or if it's coming from the private sector nowadays. Right? Governments are clients just any other. But the most important thing that can be a limiting factor or can be an accelerating factor, it is going to be coordination. Right? So there's interest from the private sector, there's interest from investors, there's interest from governments. Do we have the right institutions, the right interfaces that allow all those interests to align, and so that every stakeholder can work together to make things progress as fast as we would like to? So over the next decade, we're going to see this happening very often. I don't think that capital is going to be the main issue. Uh, I think that our ability to develop those interfaces that enable stakeholders to work together, that's going to be probably the main limiting factor, or the factor that will enable us to get to the moon faster.
Very interesting. So you mentioned geopolitical potential climate there. You mentioned, technology, obviously capital, which you don't think will be an issue, and I don't think so either. If you had a magic wand and could fix any issue you have right now, any bottleneck, what do you think? What do you think you would do right now?
That's a very good question. New space is a term that defines this new era of commercial space companies, startups that are part of this new trend, right, by having the private sector involved in the space economy. One lesson that we learned from this experience is that designing the right policies create, creates the incentives for all these actors to come together. Just to give a very tangible example here, NASA used to uh, design rockets and procure technology from prime contractors. Right? The incentive there was not necessarily to be able to produce the technology that is state of the art, but produce the technology that is the safest. And that came with a cost. Right? And sometimes the periods of development would extend. That changed completely when NASA decided to stop paying for projects
Mhm.
and and began paying for services in a competitive way. That's how SpaceX, which was a startup at the time, uh, managed to come up with a different way of doing things and compete with the big players and eventually succeed. Right? I think that's a very good example of a successful design of a policy, and goes back to what I mentioned about interfaces, right? This interface between NASA and startups became much more clear, and the incentives were much more aligned. I believe that for us to make the next step, the incentive structure that will come from this top-down approach uh, would be one thing that I would like to see addressed. At the same time, I believe that it will be a bottom-up phenomenon. Right? Civil society, entrepreneurs, someone who's not in the government or in the big corporation that will be creating those layers that will enable the execution of policy, that will enable these stakeholders to come together and facilitate this transition to the next step that we're going to see in the space economy.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean the space industry as a whole, getting more people involved in the private sector, obviously. NASA kind of taking a step back certainly limits things, right? So I think those incentives are extremely important to get things going. So that's very interesting. I really like how you answered that. Listen, Sydney, I think we could talk all day, man, but I really appreciate your time. Where can our listeners find you and your company?
Yes, I wish I were more active on social media, uh, but we have a web page,
Yeah.
seldorcapital.com. Mostly, feel free to reach out if you're building something that is extraordinary. Uh, if you think in terms of decades, not only your next business cycle, and feel free also to share ideas. Uh, we are an ecosystem that is very collaborative. There's competition for sure, but the space is a very small niche, and we're always in touch with each other. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much, Alex.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it and have a good rest of your day.
Likewise.